Hey friends, Joe Edelmann here, doing sort of a special edition video. I get a lot of questions about the mixing and mastering that I do on my covers and original songs, and so I thought it might be cool to walk through a little more detail on the mix that I did for the song Deck's Dark. And, I made a video previously about my process for making the covers, going from kind of recording and filming and editing. So this video is meant to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit more around specifically the mixing stage of the process and the stuff that I do inside of Logic Pro, which is my digital audio workstation of choice. So I'm going to kind of go through the tracks in groups, talk about the plugins that I use, any sort of additional kind of tricks and tips that I've come across, either through experimentation or through watching other folks' videos and tutorials. Hopefully this is helpful to you. If you have any more specific questions, I'm happy to dive in, respond in the comments, or make future videos on this topic as well. So let's kind of jump into it. I've got the session pulled up here, and the first thing you'll notice is that at the top is the reference track that I used for this session. So it is the studio version of Deck's Dark, and you can see if I play a little bit of it here, is the song, right? And so what I use that for, obviously, what I discussed in the other video, is I set up sort of a tempo scaffold at the top. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger. You can see, so I kind of automate the tempo where it changes in the song. This is an example, of a song, at least for Radiohead, since there is sort of a drum machine element, the tempo stays fairly constant, as opposed to, if it were a live performance I was using as a reference track or one of their non-drum machine tracks, then there would be a lot more variation. So I have that track there, and I use that to lay down the drums first, and then I get to a certain point, like I said in the other video, and start to then lay down guitars and things on top of my own tracks as opposed to the reference track. But I kind of keep it there along the way, listening for different things to give me ideas for the mixing, see if I can hear parts where they're panned and different effects that are on them. So I keep that in the session as a point of comparison. So you can see, just to kind of walk through the tracks, what I have. I added this color coding after the fact. Sometimes I'm lazy and, everything just sort of is the same color. I'm going to make this part smaller again. So we have the main vocal track. I've labeled Thom vocal. The choir parts that I laid down, I had a lot of fun doing this. So obviously there is a actual choir in the song. I am not a choir, but I am able to multi-track record, which is fun. So I did kind of 3 different harmony voices, myself singing, sort of falsetto parts, and layered them, panned them around, and added some reverb, and I'll touch upon that more in a little bit, but that was a really fun part to put together for the song. We've got Thom's guitar part that I recorded, again, live while I was singing. What I've called surfy guitar dub. There's a part that pops in towards the end of the song, I think in the right channel. There's kind of bursts of very reverbed out, bright, springy guitar. There's the Ed O'Brien guitar part, which is predominantly, this very ethereal tremolo picking delay part, but also plays along with sort of the choir riff during the second verse. We've got Jonny's awesome, also reverb-drenched ending guitar solo, and then Jonny's piano part, which I played, including the parts at the end. The bass track, this is what Boutique 78 is, the drum machine that I replicated. 78 stands for CR 78, or Compu Rhythm 78, the famous Roland drum machine from the 70s, the Phil Collins In the Air Tonight drum machine, but also the one that Radiohead used recently in some of their kind of backyard type sessions from a moon-shaped pool. It's got a really unique kind of, dry, crispy kind of sound that's not exactly like drums, but has its own personality, and I thought it fit well with this track. I don't actually know, if they were using a CR78 in the recorded version. It sounds like it might actually be Jonny's modular synth making those kind of ticky drum machine sounds, but I thought it sounded good, so I included it in the track. And then finally, the acoustic drum performance that I did, and so you can see that there. So I'll probably start from the bottom here with the drums and then work my way back up top. Let's start with this track so you can just hear in isolation. First I've turned off all the mastering plugins that I put on the master mix bus. So I'll touch upon those at the end, but for now we're just going to listen to all the tracks with just their individual plugins before and after and the channel volumes. So this is the CR78 track, so let's have a listen to that. And that's probably been turned down a little bit in the mix. I'll just bring it up for a second, just so you can hear it. So a pretty basic beat that loops throughout pretty much the entire song. I'm using just the stock sounds from Logic's library. They have what's called Boutique 78. It's just a CR78 preset. And I'm doing little, if any, processing on the individual tracks. Sometimes I will add, some additional plugins. And, they actually, when you pick different sounds in the library, already kind of put certain effects on them. I think this has a little sub bass enhancement on the kick drum, maybe a bit of bit crusher effect on the snare, and a little bit of bit crusher on the hi-hats, but really it's just a very simple beat. And so that's kind of the foundation. That's what I started with. It helped as sort of an addition to the metronome at the tempo while playing along with the reference track. It was good to have this as well to really lay down a consistent beat. Okay. So that's the CR78 track. Listen to the acoustic drums. I'm going to play them first with all the plugins on, and then I'll break it down track by track, what I'm doing to each individual drum part. And so you can see, just in terms of general principle, what I'm going for when I play with the faders and the mix and the balance of each of these drums. Not only am I looking for, kind of cohesion between the kit, but the overall kind of, loudest sounds, the kicks and the snares. I want to kind of see the master volume be around -10 to -8 dB, just as a kind of solid foundation. I know I'm going to have to keep adding more and more elements, and I want to keep, a good amount of headroom left at the end, so I don't want huge transient spikes, big hits from the snare or kick, kind of overloading or clipping the entire mix. So that's something I look out for. I'm an okay drummer, but sometimes my playing isn't super consistent, so I have to watch out for transient spikes. So these are the drums. I'm going to turn off the plugins. Well, first I'm going to deselect the group. So you can notice that when I solo the drums or mute them, it affects all 6 tracks at the same time. And that's just a useful feature in Logic. You can set up different groups, so that you can interact with tracks kind of all for one at a time. It just makes things easier. And it especially helps me with editing, because I've recorded these 6 mics and I do multiple takes. And if I need to comp or composite those together, I make sure that I have the group set up so that I'm making changes to all the tracks that belong with one performance at a time. So I'm going to turn off the drum group for now, just so that we can isolate and solo each of the individual drums. So I'm going to start with actually the overheads, which are the mics, the 2 mics that I have placed above the kit in sort of a quasi XY type pattern. For me, these mics are pretty important because, they're capturing the entire kit, and, predominantly they get a lot of the cymbals, obviously, but they really do provide that whole picture. So you want to try to make sure that they sound, as good as they can, so that you're kind of using all the other mics, the close mics, for reinforcement of specific sounds, but you're not relying on them too heavily to change the sound of the drums, because they are going to sound really like what the drums sound like in the room. And the room that I'm recording the drums in is probably not the perfect one for recording drums. It has a low ceiling. My drums are in the corner of a room, so there's some kind of weird frequencies that get reinforced. But I do my best with placing the mics, to my ear, and doing a little trickery with EQ and reverb to kind of get them to sound like they're in a slightly more fancy space than they are. Okay, so I'm going to turn off all the plugins first, and then I'll talk about the plugins that I'm adding, what each of them does, and how I have them set up. So this is the overheads without any processing. So, not a super exciting sound. The mics I have, decent. They kind of came with one of those, meant for live performance type kits from Shure. So they're PG81s, I think, small diaphragm condenser mics. I've got them in, again, that kind of XY-ish type pattern above the top of the kit, maybe a foot or 2 above the cymbals. So I'm going to do some stuff with the equalization and compression to kind of get them to be a little more lively or energetic sounding. So first thing I'm adding is this stock channel EQ plugin from Logic. I use a lot of stock plugins in my mixes. I think they're great, especially in Logic. I love just kind of seeing that graphic EQ and knowing where I'm slicing and dicing in terms of the frequency. So let's just pull it up, and I'll show you what I've done. So I'll turn it on and I'll show you the frequencies. So first thing I'm doing, and I do this to a lot of my microphones, unless they really need it, I'm shelving off the super low end, sub frequencies. I do a little bit of stuff with the kick and bass in terms of adding some more excitement in that range after the fact, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But for a lot of mics, guitars especially, vocals, you really don't need a lot of the frequency information below, say, 100 hertz. In this case with drums, the kick drum I see as living somewhere between, on the lowest end, maybe 60 hertz to 100 hertz, something around that is really the low end. And everybody does it differently, and everybody has a different frequency that they like for drums or for different drums. I kind of like it there. So I've rolled off, I've used a filter again below 48 hertz here. In terms of the lows that I do want, so actually this is uncharacteristically wide range here for these overheads that I'm boosting, but I'm putting a shelf boost at 276 hertz, so everything below 276 hertz, giving 1 decibel boost with a really wide scope. So this is kind of my additional oomph or low range to the sound. This frequency I cut in a lot of mics. This is kind of like the bad room frequency that I find in a lot of my mixes, in that room, in that space. The 500 hertz frequency, that kind of low mid-range, it really gets reinforced in a not so pleasing way, and it kind of, dampens the sound. So I like to cut that out, not too dramatically, but maybe a couple decibels. So here's 1.5 decibels out at 500 hertz, and we'll see that come up more and more. Otherwise, not doing too much to the upper mid-range, and in the very high end, for overheads, because again, they are kind of also the cymbal mics. So I'm bringing up at above 6 hertz a shelf, 2 decibels, just to give more brightness to the cymbals and give a little bit more air to the sound of the overhead. So listen to, I'll do before and then after. So let me turn off the EQ. So this is before and after. And I'm not using really big sweeps here other than the low end filter. So you may not actually hear too much of a difference. It's really just, a little bit around the edges. Don't like to make super dramatic moves a lot of the time, really, when I'm EQing, unless there's truly a frequency that I hate or that I, didn't really capture well. Probably should have captured better at the source, but I'll be more dramatic in those cases. But for most of the time on mics, I'm really just doing a little bit around the edges. What I'm doing next is I'm adding a compressor. And so in this case, I'll pause it. In this case, I'm using the SSL style mix bus compressor from Waves. Really like this compressor. I use it most of the time, and I'll talk about it. I use it all the time in the mastering stage and sort of the mix bus. That's what it's most famously known for, as being used as a mix bus compressor, but you can also use it kind of on overheads or drum buses to kind of tighten up and glue up the sound a little bit. So I've got it set with a pretty low ratio, so not a lot of compression, a slower attack time so that I don't kill the transients, the hits of the snares and kicks too much. And I've got the threshold, reasonable, so you'll see it compressing. Other than that, makeup gain to compensate for the loss of gain from compression. And automatic release time, I just let the compressor decide when to give up on compressing. And that's basically it. So let's listen without, and then I'll punch it in. So this is without. And with. So the main thing you're saying is that it does add volume and gain, so it's kind of cheating a little bit. I'm really actually making the track louder, and a lot of times we think louder sounds better. But you can see that it is squeezing, so you see the needle on the compression moving, jumping, maybe 2 decibels, nothing super dramatic, but enough to kind of give it a little more energy and vibe to the performance. And let's go to the kick drum. So the kick drum, I recorded this with a Sennheiser mic. I forget the exact number, but kind of their standard kick dynamic mic inside of the front port of the drum head facing towards where the beater hits. I'm looking for a decent amount of attack. I want to hear the click of the beater, not to like a death metal extreme, but, enough so that it has definition, but also, to get the body and the sound, the fullness of the drum. So let's listen to the kick without any processing. Let me turn it up. So that's the kick sound, completely raw. The first thing that I add is a noise gate. I'm using Logic's stock noise gate plugin, and this is because, there's not perfect isolation between the different mics of my drum kit, so the kick is hearing some of the snare is hearing some of the kick, and depending on what you're going for in the song, nobody can ever achieve perfect isolation, but there are ways of positioning mics so that you get as least bleed as possible. I always end up getting a little, and depending on how clean I want each track to sound, I will add more or less of this kind of gating to really separate the hits that I want from the ones that I don't. So, here I've just got this set up to try to just hear the kicks. So you can hear a little bit of that snare coming through. If I turn on the noise gate, you should just hear the kicks. Right? And so it's a balancing act of setting up the threshold and the amount of reduction. I use this look ahead feature so that it knows to open up. You don't want it, the worst thing you want with gates is for them to sound unnatural because they clamp and you miss a transient of the instrument you do want because it's the threshold set the wrong way. So I try to be, cautious and listen carefully when I'm applying these things so that they don't sound unnatural, and I'll back off the reduction if that's the case and live with a little bit of bleed. But this helps it clean up the sound a little bit when all the mics come together. So that's the gate. And then I add an EQ. Again, I'm shelving, and even though this is the kick drum and I want a good amount of sub bass energy, and I'll talk about that more in a second, let me just turn it on. I'm, rolling off below 49 hertz, a filter. I've boosted, this is, for this mic, for the kick, the fundamental frequency that I really want, the oomph frequency, again, centered in that sort of 70 to 100 range. So I've used 90 hertz, 91 hertz, boosted that by 2.5 decibels, cutting my bad room frequency. Again, the room, this is a pretty close mic, so it doesn't super factor in, but for the bass drum, sometimes low mids can clutter up that sound a little bit too. So I've cut a little bit at 500 and I've boosted a little bit at 2000 or 2 kilohertz, which is sort of where the beater, the ticky frequency lives. So maybe it could be anywhere from 1, in terms of 1 kilohertz to 3 kilohertz. You just kind of have to decide, and you want to pick a frequency. You have to think ahead because the snare also has an attack and you don't want those frequencies to conflict. So sometimes you have to juggle a little bit, but I've picked 2 kilohertz there for the snare. For the kick. So let's listen to the EQ before and after. So without. And bringing it in. So again, pretty subtle difference. You're going to hear a little bit more of the attack from the 2 kilohertz, and you've gotten rid of a little bit of the volleyball or beach ball in the middle. Not dramatically. I could have done more in this range. You can see the frequency response, obviously. Sometimes I take this harmonic, whichever the one is, right after the fundamental, kind of right here. I'll cut that out a little bit, but I'm not playing with that too much here. I want a pretty natural sound. It depends on what you're going for. If you're going for a more processed sound for a certain era of drums or different, styles, and I cover different artists. But for this type of sound and for this era of Radiohead, I'm trying to let it be a little bit more naturalistic. And then the next is I'm using a DBX 160 style compressor. This is from Waves. I like this compressor a lot, especially on drums. I like to use presets a lot of the time. I will mess with parameters a little bit, but some of the presets are great, and it's just easy and quick to kind of get to a certain sound. So here I've just have the bass drum mild setting. I don't really want a lot of compression, but just a little bit. Again, it's going to kind of cheat the gain a little bit because there's a gain boost on this setting, but there should be like a little bit of compression that's happening, not too much. So I'll turn that on. You can kind of see the needle kick, when it's compressing, 1 decibel maybe at most, and it's just fine. I'm just getting a little bit of the sound of the plug-in of the compression without, overdoing it. Okay, and then finally, what I'm adding is this Waves Renaissance Bass plugin. And so this is where I use, I'm mixing on speakers and I'm not using a subwoofer when I mix most of the time, or any of the time. I don't have a subwoofer for mixing. To kind of, it's a delicate act because, sometimes if you can't hear the sub frequencies and it's because you don't have a subwoofer, if you boost them too much, then, on any speakers, you're gonna just get muddiness and it's gonna muddy up the mix. But I really do like this plugin because it does add some exciting, stuff to those sub frequencies, the kind of subwoofer frequencies, but you have to kind of just use it judiciously. So I do add, bring the intensity back. I usually load it up. I pick a frequency here. I've got it kind of centered at around 80 hertz, that kind of low kick frequency that I like. And it just adds a little bit more body and size to the drum. So let's listen without and with. So you can that's probably the most dramatic difference of the plugins that you can hear. And it really makes a difference in the picture of the whole mix. In isolation, it sounds good, but of course, anything you do has to sound good in the context of everything in the mix. So that's the kick drum. Let's move on to the snare. I actually have 2 snare mics. So I don't do this all the time. In fact, recently either because I just needed that other SM57 somewhere else. I haven't been using an under snare mic, but when I can, it's nice to have a mic underneath the snares as well as on top. Both of them are SM57s, the world's most popular recording mic ever. Cheap, effective. Yeah, so I've got that set. And you have to flip the phase on one of them. So you don't want phase cancellation because that will make the sound really thin. In terms of the processing to the snare, the top snare mic, again, pretty similar array to the kick drum. I've got a noise gate to remove the unwanted hits from the kick that you're hearing. So let's just listen to that. Let's start with this mic. So without it, you can hear a lot of the kick, and you can hear a decent amount of the hi-hat. I mean, hi-hat bleed is the number one thing with snare mics, but that's a little bit unavoidable. With the noise gate, let's listen again. Still there, you can still hear a little bit of the kick and the hi-hats, but not nearly as much. Next, I'm using the stock channel EQ plugin again. That is a strangely sharp boost. I don't usually do. That's interesting. So common things that I do, right? I'm using the high pass filter to roll off below 100 hertz here. For snares, you don't need the frequencies that the kick is going to need, right? You want those drums to stand apart from each other, and you don't want to conflict with like the bass guitar or anything like that. I'm boosting at around 180 hertz. So with the snare, you want to kind of pick the body frequency too, right? What is like the kind of meat of the snare? It depends on how you have the snare tuned and the size of your snare, a lot of things. For me, it's right around 200 hertz, something around that, right? So I've boosted that by a substantial amount because on its own, the mic is a little bit thin sounding. We'll listen without it, right? So without the EQ. It's there, but it's more mids, and it's more upper mids than it is low, right? There's not as much of the body of the snare hits in this mic, and I want that from the top snare mic. So if I add in the EQ, you can see, right, that is the frequency, and it's getting boosted. And I've done the thing which I kind of talked about with the kick drum examples. I found that kind of first overtone, what's like the biggest ringing frequency that comes up after that frequency, and I've cut that a little bit so that it kind of cleans up the sound of the snare just a tiny bit. And then a little bit of a dip around 1.5 kilohertz. Not quite sure why I did this. Maybe I was listening to some other frequencies that I didn't want, or I wanted to give more space to a guitar or something like that. But that's a very minimal move. I doubt that even makes a huge difference. And what will make a difference is the attack frequencies, the high energy, a little bit of the snare wires, and even though this is the top snare mic, so at 5 kilohertz is where I've added 3.5 decibels of boost, and a little bit of shelf for the high stuff, but not too much. And then finally the DBX160 again, same compressor, and I'm using just a preset for snare, just to give it more energy and more thwack. So that was pretty substantial. You can hear that, you can see it compressing, right? Maybe 3 decibels of compression, something like that. Not too squashed, but just enough to make it sound cool. And the last thing that I have been doing this whole time, but neglected to mention, is that this snare is going to ascend with what is Logic's Space Designer plugin, which is one of their kind of stock reverb plugins. And I like it because it has a lot of different like physical spaces modeled, right? So this one is Snare Chamber. It's kind of a small room sound, and I'm using that to simulate how the drum might sound in a true, kind of wood-paneled recording studio, as opposed to my low-ceilinged, carpeted kind of drum room, as it were. So without it, just to listen to the snare without that reverb that I've added. It's a lot drier, right? With the reverb, just adds a little bit more naturalism. Or realism. So that is the snare. On the under snare, just to touch briefly, just listen to what that sounds like on its own. Turn it up a little bit. So again, I'm just gonna go through this quickly. I'm using a noise gate to get rid of those kick hits that you can hear. And then I've used the SSL channel strip plugin. I'm adding a tiny bit of compression to that, and I'm definitely adding some high frequency and high mid frequency because this is the snare mic, so it should be bright and buzzy, right, to really get the snap of the snares. I don't even think I'm playing much with the frequencies that are selected, centered at around 8 and 3 kilohertz. And then I'm cutting some low mids. I don't really need the same body or the low end that the other snare mic or the other mics are picking up. So let's listen to it with the plugins added. And then in combination with the top snare mic. Sounds like a snare drum. Let's listen to the kick, snare, and overheads now together. Bring back down the snare. So that's really the bulk of the sound. The only other mics I have are for the tom drums, which I only hit a few times in the song, but let's go for where we have a tom fill here. Okay. Let's just listen to those two mics soloed. I'm going to turn off the plugin, which is the same I'll talk about in a second, but this is just those mics by themselves. I should probably turn them up a little bit so you can hear them. They sound like toms. But the main thing I don't do a lot of processing to the toms. I just stick the same plugin on both of them. Let me show you how it's set up. It is the SSL channel plugin. Again, the same one that you saw I was using on the under snare mic. I love the Waves SSL plugin. I use this a lot, especially on vocals. And basically what I'm doing is a tiny bit of low end roll off, like filtering that I would have done in the Logic EQ as well. A tiny bit of compression, but 2:1 ratio. And then I am boosting a little bit at 100 hertz. That's kind of like the low end energy that I like for toms, even, racks or floor toms. Floor toms maybe a little bit lower, but you don't want them to conflict with the bass drum. So just a little bit of that low end and a little bit of high mids to get some more stick and some, the attack of the transient of hitting that drum. And I've cut a little bit of low mids so that it doesn't sound too muddy or dirty. And then most importantly, what I'm really using the plugin for, like 70% of why I'm using it, is the built-in noise gate here, which I've set so that I basically, I know I'm only hitting the mics, when I do a tom fill, which is not super often in the song. And so I kind of want the sound to be as clean as possible, not too much mud from these mics on the rest of the kit. Some people like the sounds of the tom mics blended in with the rest of the kit for the whole of the song, but it depends on, again, how good your room sounds and how good your mics are and everything like that. So for me, I just like them to really fill in and make the tom fills just feel a little louder. So this is without the gates on. I'm just going to, for the example, for the high tom, you just hear what it sounds like when they're hearing the rest of the kit. So this is without the gate. And then this is with the gate added in, so you should just only hear the hit. Right, and so again, with gates, it takes some tweaking to set the threshold and the range just right so that it's only canceling out the rest of the kit and not the hits. You basically just test to make sure you're getting the hit and it's not choking off too soon. And it has a natural kind of release time, right? Release time is actually very important to set for this so that you get a good decay. And that's the same thing. I do the same exact thing on the floor tom, so I'll just let that be the same. And that is how I process the drums. I mean, I've started to do it more and more, and I have some kind of routines and shortcuts that I take, but it is kind of, to me, the hardest thing to get sounding great in a live audio recording, and so I do spend a decent chunk of time on those, and I spend comparatively less time and processing on the guitars, because most of that I'm thinking about the sound and I'm really curating it at the amp and the pedal level and less at the recording level. But I do some post-processing with effects on the guitars, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so moving on to the bass guitar, let us have a listen. And I'm just going to bring it up just to full volume, and I'm going to turn off all the plugins, and then I'll talk about what I'm using. Let's listen to maybe this section of the song where there's some good bass action going on. So I recorded this with my Squier P-Bass with flat wound strings going into a Gens-Benz shuttle amp head, which has a DI output out of the back of the head. So I record that signal. I don't put a mic in front of the cabinet. I have a, speaker cabinet that I listen to monitor the sound of the bass when I'm recording it. But I actually really just take the DI signal out of the back of the amp, and then that way I can do some more stuff in terms of amp simulation after the fact inside of Logic. So the first thing that I'm doing to this bass sound is I'm adding compression, and I'm adding a much more substantial amount of compression here because I really want to even out, the string volumes and the note volumes, which is a hard thing, in bass. Different notes and different frets, things resonate, a little bit more than others. But I really kind of want the volume to be present, especially this is a very bass-heavy song. It has a really kick-ass bass line, which I had so much fun playing, but I really wanted to try to get each of those notes to kind of speak as best as I could. So the first thing I'm doing is running it right into Logic's stock compressor. I'm using the vintage FET field effect transistor, I forget what that stands for, setting. And I am using a very high ratio, 8:1. I've got the threshold not super low though, so I mean, everything with the compression is a balance of how high you set the ratio versus how low you set the threshold in terms of how much compression is actually going to happen. But there is, you'll see in a second, a good amount of compression happening here. And the thing that I like about Logic's stock compressor is it has this kind of auto gain feature. So, there is a makeup gain you can use to boost the level for when you've, reduced it because of compression, but you can also use this kind of checkbox to kind of automatically recompensate the gain of your track from the compression to make it a specified kind of loudness level approximately. So I'm using the -12 dB, compensation setting, which I find gives it like a nice, loud, not too loud type setting. So let me play you what the compressor sounds like. So this is without the compression. And I'm gonna turn the compressor on. So without, with. And so you can see it didn't add too much volume per se, right? But it did add squeeze, and you can kind of hear the sustain of the notes brings out a little bit, and it adds a little bit of that, pumping kind of sound that the compressor is known for. So after the compressor, this is what I was talking about before, I use Logic's built-in bass amp simulator plugin. And what I'm really going for is that classic Ampeg 8x10 SVT, the bass stack of classic rock and of, so many bassists, since it's a really legendary sound, including Colin Greenwood is an SVT, Ampeg stack user, right? So I want that, body, because I'm not using a speaker cabinet when I record, the sound of the DI, out of the back of the amp. You heard it, right? It's not terrible, it's musical, and it's, there's some EQ in the amp, so it is coloring the sound a little bit. It's a little bright, right? It's more of a upper mids kind of thing, and you can hear a lot more of the string, but I want to kind of beef it up, bring it a little lower into the low and low mids, and Ampeg just kind of has that sound. So this is the setting. I basically use the preset called Big Stack, but I do a little tweaking around the EQs, so you can just see how I've set it up here. But let's just listen to it again without, and then I'll bring it in. So this is without the amp sim. adding in the amp sim. So it kind of changed, the whole sound profile of the sound, right? So the upper mids got reduced a lot. There is still some of that high end, but it's really brought it down into that 250 hertz and below, sub bass kind of sound. And I'm even using some of the, there is a built-in compressor in the amp sim, so I'm adding some of that compression too. And then next I'm going to use a channel EQ plugin, again, stock Logic plugin, not doing too much here, just taking off, again, super low end and super high end, just kind of filtering at both ends because I only care about the frequency information there in between. Boosting at where I see, my bass guitar frequency. It's at like frequencies that I think of and then I've kind of come back to time and again when I'm mixing. For bass, it's like anywhere from 200 to 300 hertz, maybe 250 hertz. It's kind of close to the snare frequency, I guess, so you don't want those two to conflict too much. But that's where I like to mix rock bass guitars, right? Sort of in that, it has sub bass energy from the amp, and I'll add a little bit more in a second, which you'll see, but I really want the meat of it to be more in the not quite guitar space, not quite kick drum space. Some people treat the bass more like the kick drum and bring the kick up into like kind of the lower mids. It's totally up to the song and up to you and which one you prefer. So let's just listen with the EQ and without the EQ and then with the EQ. So without. And then adding in the EQ. Got a little pop there from a transient. I don't know if that was it might have just been the plugin latency. You get the idea. And then finally, from the same idea as the kick drum, I've got the Renaissance bass plugin. I've tuned the frequency up a little bit, so it's not the same frequency that I'm exciting as the kick drum. Close to. It actually might be. No, I think I was using 80 in the other case, but but not too much intensity because I don't want it to go completely subby, flubby, and ruin the mix. But just enough to kind of add some hype and make it even more, Colin on stage with a giant amplifier. So let's listen without and with. So without. And then with. And that is how I process the bass track. Okay, so next we'll listen to Jonny's piano track from the intro of the song. So in order, the plugins that I'm adding are EQ, compression, a little bit of plate reverb from one of my favorite reverbs ever, which is the Sound Toys Little Plate. And then I'm using a direction mixer plugin inside of Logic instead of kind of the pan knob, because this is a stereo track. I recorded stereo out of the Nord piano. So I'm just using this direction mixer to kind of pan it equal strength, kind of both channels over to the left a little bit. Yes, to the left channel a little bit more. So the EQ I'm using here, I don't actually recall setting it up this way, but I might have started from a preset here because I usually don't use this many overlapped boosts, or at least these wide of these boosts in these ranges. But really what you can see, the result of this is that there's a lot more low mid or mid range. This is very mid range heavy, and I've rolled off below 60 hertz and above 4.4K hertz, dampened kind of the sound of the piano a little bit. It's not super bright, glassy, unlike a Karma Police or something like that, right? It's a kind of a mellow piano sound. So it's really kind of that mid-range thing. So let's listen without the EQ and then adding the EQ in. And then adding in the EQ. It's really mostly adding volume, it's not a lot of disparity between the additions of these frequencies. It's kind of boosting everything in the meat of where the sound is and cutting off any unnecessary frequencies. Then the compressor, I don't use, it depends, but on piano, not super aggressive compression because, you want to kind of, you want some dynamics in the playing, right? The whole point of a piano is to kind of have a little bit of loud soft. I've got a piano preset, the DBX. It's the stereo version of the DBX plugin. And so I'll just bring that in. So without the compression, and adding in the compression, which here serves to add a lot of volume. As you can see, this preset's really driving the input of the compressor. And then, there's a little bit of a wet-dry mix thing going on. It's not all compressor, but it is a decent chunk. And then the reverb. Now, this is the fun part. I love this reverb plugin. I use it on like everything, almost every mix I do, original songs, covers. I use it on vocals, I use it on drums, I use it on any instrument that I just want to add ambience or like liveliness to, right? It's just a really nice sounding plate reverb. So this is a short setting. I'm not using a super spacey one here. It's just a 1 second reverb. I've cut out some of the low end because it has a kind of built-in filter. Since I'm putting it directly on the channel, most of the time, I'll put my reverbs in send tracks or buses so that I can send multiple tracks to them. But in this case, if I'm just kind of quickly grab a reverb and stick it on the track. So here I just kind of stuck it in on the track. So let's listen to what that sounds like. So that's without the reverb. There is a little bit of reverb in the sound from the Nord piano. The Nord piano has some reverb on it, but with the little plate, this is what it sounds like. So it sounds like, again, I'm playing in a bigger, nicer piano hall than I was. You can really hear it when I stop. When I stop the track, you hear the decay of the reverb. And then finally, less exciting, you will hear it come out of more of the left speaker because I've panned it using Direction Mixer. So that's mostly it for the piano. Again, the other thing I'm doing here, which I haven't kind of talked about as much for the other tracks, but you can see when I go to this view, right, my automation, I try to make as much use of automation as I can because it adds, dynamics to the track. You don't want everything to be all the same volume all the time. So you want to, play with different parts in different sections and see what really needs to be louder or softer, what's competing. So in the piano, I've kind of boosted it during that middle section when it's playing out that kind of melody with the choir. And I've boosted it at the end when it plays in unison with Jonny's guitar solo. So just to show you that track lane, turn that back on, right? So again, there's kind of differences, maybe 2 or 3 decibels at a time, relative change between the sections. Just adds, it's subtle, but you do notice it, right? The mix, you can use it to help it poke out in certain areas or hide it when it doesn't need to be. Okay, so next we'll take a look at the guitar tracks. There are 4 different guitar tracks. I have Thom's part, again, which I performed while singing the vocal. There is this surfy guitar overdub from the outro of the song. Not sure who played that originally on the recording. I've kind of lumped it in under Thom's tone. I was using the Casino when I played it, but it could have very well been Jonny or Ed as an overdub. And then we've got Ed's guitar part and Jonny's outro solo. Again, he's playing piano for most of the song. Live, he switches off and plays the guitar. Outro, here I've kind of replicated the studio where he's playing the piano riff and the guitar riff in unison. So let's take a listen first to Ed's guitar that kicks off the song. So just a listen. Let me turn the volume up and turn off any automation that's going on. Okay. It's very ambient, soupy kind of sound. A lot of that is happening, in the pedal that I'm using, the Deluxe Memory Man, and in the amp and the way that I have the guitar set up. But I'm adding a little bit of post-processing, right? So I have a compressor. This is Logic's stock compressor. I've chosen a slightly different mode, so I'm using a VCA mode. Low ratio, not a lot of compression. With guitars, I really just kind of will bring it up, usually use what the default setting is, which is usually, not a super aggressive compression, just a little bit. And it just really gives it a little bit more volume, a little bit more excitement. But I don't want it to change the transient or how it feels. I don't want it to be as squashy, like for example, like the bass was pretty high and squashed, right? But I don't want the pick attack or anything to change. So I really just use a subtle compression. So this is without the compressor. Let me turn everything off. So without it, and then with the compressor. So you can see it's 1, maybe 2 decibels of compression, gain reduction happening, not too much, but just enough to kind of give it a little bit more excitement. Then I'm going to add in the EQ, and here I've done even more low shelving off, right? So everything below, say 138, right? I've kind of brought that low filter off, the high pass filter, the low roll off filter up there. I'm boosting the mid range, for Ed's guitars, especially his ambient stuff. I like to really boost, kind of really the heart of the mid range, somewhere between 5 and 1 kilohertz. And so that's kind of where I've got this big mountain here in the middle, in the mid range. And then here I'm rolling off high end, depending on the guitar part, if I want it to be brighter sounding or more chimey, like a daydreaming or something like that, I would keep those frequencies in there. But here I've rolled them off to make the sound a little blurrier, right? To just kind of blur off the pick attacks and the note and the transients of my tremolo picking, just make it sound more like one smudge of sound, like a pad. So that's the EQ. Just play it once again without the EQ, with the EQ. So you can kind of hear it, put a little bit of a blanket over the sound. And then finally, again, I'm using a little plate reverb here. Just set a little bit longer, 2 seconds. And I say finally, but I really shouldn't, because once again, I neglected to look at my sends. I am using a send here, and I've got it automated, so it's only doing the send you'll see in these automation lanes, right? It's called Extra MM, which is Extra Memory Man. So I actually have another great Sound Toys plugin, which is the Echo Boy, running on an insert on a send channel, right? And I've got that set up with its Memory Man. It has a lot of great emulations of tape echoes and different types of delays. It's an awesome delay plugin. But I've got the Memory Man mode, so it's just Memory Man on top of Memory Man. It's just adding even more repeats to the soup and more ambience, and it's also a stereo plugin, so even though I have Ed's guitar panned to the right, this adds a little bit of echo in the left, so it just kind of gives it more width and space. So without that extra delay, here's what it sounds like. And then adding it in. And again, you hear it more in the context of the mix, but it's a subtle difference, but I like to add these things just to add a little bit more space to the sound. So that's Ed's guitar. And then let's take a look at Thom's guitar. So the main guitar here. So Thom, in a lot of later Radiohead era playing, he keeps things pretty simple, pretty clean. There's not a lot to the sound. There's maybe a little bit of overdrive, but it's a mostly clean sound through the Vox with his Casino. There's not a lot of effects, almost no effects on the sound. So I'm really just adding a little bit of EQ here. You'll see what it looks like. It's really just a high roll off. I'm actually doing nothing else to the sound besides rolling off some of the highest frequencies, so it gives it, just a little bit of a warmer tone knob rolled down kind of sound without this EQ. Not that different, because again, the frequencies aren't there. It's actually not going to cut anything, but you'll hear a little difference. That's it. The other plugin that I have is another Echo Boy. This is the kind of compact version of the plugin, and I put it right on the channel like I did, in the other case with the plate reverb, just to, again, I'm kind of duplicating effect. I used the delay effect when I was playing. Let's just go to at the end of the song, right where he does that repeating delay riff. I added a preset on the delay that sounds at the same rate as the one I was using when I recorded it, so it just kind of thickens the sound, right? This is a quarter note delay here at the tempo, which is 139 BPM. So without it, with it, and I also have it set to sort of a Memory Man type thing. You hear when I stop, there's a little bit of an extra repeat, but it's really not, it's not changing much. It's just a little bit of extra patchwork around the edges, right? And then the outro guitar, I don't think I did too much to this one either. I'm sending it to another plate reverb, right? I'll just preview this, right? Just a little bit of extra reverb. I put a lot of reverb. I forget if I was using a pedal or if I was just using my Fender amp and cranking the spring on it. Probably that, but basically I've just got that set up. So I'm using automation here to just kind of punch it in. I recorded it, I recorded more, and then I kind of just punched it in where I was hearing it occur in the song. And then in terms of, I have a little bit of EQ, well, actually a lot of EQ. I've rolled off everything. I want this to be brighter, and I don't want any of the meat of the guitar chords to conflict with the other. There's a lot of stuff going on between the solo and the piano, so I don't want, too much of a conflict. So I've rolled up everything below 300 hertz and everything above 6 or 7 kilohertz, and then added a little bit of peak in that bright, I want it to be bright, twangy, surfy, right? So I've kind of boosted that 3.6 kilohertz here. So let's listen to without the reverb. I might just turn off the volume automation just so you can hear it. Adding in the EQ, and then adding in the automation, which you'll see it kind of punch in and out. And then finally, on to Jonny's guitar solo from the end of the song, which is drenched in sporadic reverb. So what I did to achieve that, I didn't have a stomp box, a reverb stomp box. I have a TC Electronic Hall of Fame reverb pedal, but the foot switch I didn't feel was necessarily robust enough to get the quick kind of stomp in and out that he does in the song. He uses a Boss RV6, I think, when he plays the song live to get this effect of kind of kicking the spring on a reverb, right? Just kind of kicking it in for the third beat, those stabs in the third beat of the bar. So what I did was I just used automation. I put a send to Logic's pedal board. Logic has some great pedal sims too. Their amp sims are great, their pedal sims are great. So I just stacked a whole bunch of springs, right? Spring reverbs and a little bit of EQ to give it kind of a mid-range, noisy, nasally kind of honk to the reverb blast, right? So I put that in on this pedal board, this simmed up pedal board, and I just used automation to control when I was sending it to that reverb for the quick in and out of the bursts, right? And I set it up like this with the tempo of the song before I even played it, and then I monitored the effect while I was recording it so that I could actually hear what it was going to sound like as I was recording it. Okay, so without the reverb blasts, this is what it sounds like. So you can hear there is some echo. I did use the space echo pedal, the Boss pedal, so there is a little bit of echoing going on, but not the full reverb from the track, which is what I added in after the fact. So with that reverb, it sounds like this. And then, in terms of other processing that I have on the track, very similar to the other guitar tracks, there's a little bit of compression and a little bit of EQ. So stock compressor, I didn't even change it from the default setting. It's the digital, the one that you land on. I might have tweaked the ratio up a little bit and brought the threshold down to get it to squeeze a little bit more, but this is without the compressor, so. Not as much punch to the notes when I add the compressor back in. So it really gets those bursts to kind of squeeze and pop out. I also have the channel EQ, a little bit of low-end roll-off below 66, high-end roll-off. I've dipped maybe one frequency. I think it was ringing a little bit too much. Let me just take a look at the... Giving sort of a noisy feedback frequency from the reverb, and then boosting some low mids to give it a little bit more oomph. And so that is Jonny's guitar part. Okay, so next we'll take a look at the choir parts, which were probably my favorite thing that I recorded on this song. Again, it is 6 tracks here. I have them set up, grouped together, like I did for the drums. We can listen to each of the individual voices, but basically I just recorded myself multiple times, either singing the same line in terms of the different parts of the harmony. I then tried to achieve sort of that, faux choir effect by using panning. So I have you can see the voices are alternated into different left and right channels, and I've kind of, none of them are dead center, so that the kind of lead vocal stays in the dead center and the choir is kind of built around it. So I'm, panning fairly, not aggressively, but, maybe half of the way towards left or towards right in any case, and kind of just alternating each of the voices. And I've got all of them sent to a single reverb to gel them all together. Is probably one of the longer or the longest reverbs that I'm using, which is this one here. Let's check it out. So it's on a send, and it is another little plate, and I've got it set for 4 seconds, so very, cathedral-esque, with some modulation on it, which, the modulation adds a little bit more, again, of that kind of chorusing and type of, thickness to the sound, which also helps with the choir aspect. Okay, so let's listen to it first without the reverb. And then with the reverb. And so here I'm sending each of the voice tracks to the reverb pre-fader as opposed to post-fader, which is the stock or the default behavior for it, and which to me creates more of a thicker, more pronounced effect. And so just to listen to the voices, let me turn off the group and you can just hear kind of each voice that I added in. I've got sort of the main voice, which is kind of the root note of the pattern. And I double track that, so saying the same thing again, and that's going to be part of a natural chorus effect. And it's all a question of where you tuck that double. If you make it just as loud as the original, then you're going to get a lot more of those kind of natural flanging artifacts of not singing the same way twice. But you kind of tuck it in underneath that. Then I layer in the middle choir voice, which sounds like this. And then I've added in a double of that, so those little differences in timing and tuning make the effect of a real choir, which would be multiple people who do not sing exactly the same. It would be better if it was more than, just me, because no matter how hard I try, I'm still going to sound like me. And then finally the top voice, which also I've doubled. I'll just play both tracks. Whoa there. So altogether, you get a pretty cool effect. I should take this time then to talk about the plugins that I'm using on each of these tracks, which are the same that I'm using on the main vocal. There are 3 plugins that I use in my go-to vocal plugin chain. One is the stock channel EQ from Logic. The second is Soundtoys Devil Lock Deluxe, which is this very extreme compression that adds a lot of gain. Especially when I'm using an RE20 mic to record. It's a little bit of a lower output mic, so this really boosts the signal a lot and gives it an interesting energy and compression. And then finally, Waves SSL channel plugin to add just a tiny bit more compression and some final touch EQ. So let's walk through each of those, right? So I've used them on each of the choir voices, but let me go quickly to the main track again and just show you it's set up identically. I basically do the same thing on the backing vocals. The only thing I might change is I might cut a little bit more low frequencies from the backing vocals so that, the main vocal has the bulk of the body and the backing vocals don't distract or conflict. They just add a little bit more fill, right? And upper end content, but they don't clash. So let's take a look at the settings of the EQ. So this is how I set up the channel EQ. 3 moves, really. One is to do a roll-off of the low frequencies below 100. The second is a cut at that kind of bad room frequency I've talked about, which is 500 hertz. And then I'm bringing a little bit more presence and high end back with a high shelf at about 5-6 kilohertz. So let's listen. Let's just go back to the vocal.
Just a laugh, just a laugh.
So I add the EQ.
Just a laugh, even at this angle.
Subtle, not a huge difference there. Just kind of preparing it for the compression, because I like to do that, you know, whatever kind of corrective EQ I can before the compressor, because the compressor is going to really accentuate certain frequencies, or it's going to, you know, it's going to boost the gain a lot of the signal, and it may reinforce some of the bad habits or bad stuff that's going on. So I like to try to do a little bit of that cutting EQ, not too much boosting, before I get to the compressor, which is this Devil Lock. Which is an awesome compressor. It's great for drums. It's great for smacking the hell out of drum overhead mics. And you can get some cool effects that way. It's got kind of a built-in distortion that you can use. But for vocals, I like to set it up like this. I turn off the distortion and the high-end roll-off, and I just use a level of 3 for the crush, which is kind of like the ratio or the amount of compression. It compresses heavily at almost every setting, but and then I turn the mix, the blend between the wet dry up to 7, because I'm really getting a lot of my vocal sound from the mic and from this plug-in by turning it up. So this is without it.
A 10-ton hair made a wet sound.
And with it, you can see, really, I'm using it mostly like a volume boost, but it's also compressing, and it helps with the consonant sounds, and so you can hear the words. You know, it helps with my enunciation. Although, who are we kidding? Thom Yorke, he doesn't care too much about enunciation. And then finally, I'm using the SSL channel plugin again. I use this a lot. I'm doing a few things. I'm adding a tiny bit of additional compression. I am rolling off a little bit more of the low end, although most of it's already been covered by that point by the first filter. But the compressor does reinforce some frequencies. And then I'm adding some high end, a little bit of high mids. I'm cutting a little bit more of the low mids, again, some of that frequency that gets built up and amplified by the compressor. And and I'm boosting the level of the output. I'm using the output fader on the channel strip here to kind of add just a little bit more gain to my signal before I even hit the final fader for mixing. So let's listen to that without the EQ.
The grass grows over me.
With
your face in the glass, in the
it's
glass.
A little bit brighter, a little bit more
it was just a laugh, just a laugh.
And then the final piece really is the little plate reverb, another plate reverb. I use this on like every vocal that I do. It sounds awesome on vocals and on everything. So let's add that reverb in.
It's whatever you say it is.
And just depending on the song. Infinity. And just depending on the song, going for more or less delay time. If you want it to be more intimate sounding, shorter delay and shorter decay time and less reverb. For the more ethereal songs, falsetto heavy songs, I'll crank it up to a higher setting. And so that is the bulk of the effects and the processing that I did in mixing this track. Obviously you can tell a lot of subtle bits of automation and, balancing different things against each other, but really, when I get to a point where I've laid down the tracks, I'm doing a lot of these steps, putting in these plugins and doing the kind of relative volume balancing as I go. So it's not really something where I record everything and then decide I now need to mix. It's really, as I add pieces, I make sure it sits well with everything that came before it, and so on and so forth. And so the final stage really is to do what I call mastering, or sort of pseudo-mastering, because, it's not exactly the same thing, but I use a certain set of plugins to kind of bring the overall balance, make it glue a little bit more, bring the levels up to a more kind of commercial standard, not, quite as loud as radio ready, but something that'll mesh well and blend in nicely with the video. So let's go look at the master channel. So I covered this a little bit in my how to make a cover video, but just to run through those plugins again, I've got 5 plugins. The first one is an exciter, which adds a little bit of additional high harmonic or high frequency content, so it makes, you know, just a little brighter, makes the mix sound a little brighter. So without it,
Just allow, just allow.
and then adding it in. Pretty subtle. I don't set it, you know, so that you'd really hear it. I'm not cranking the balance too high, or, you know, the frequency around maybe like 10 kilohertz and above is where I set the cutoff for that. And then using a stereo spread plugin, so it is meant to kind of widen the mix sound a little bit more. I use a pretty subtle setting, just a little bit, and I bring the lower interval, the low end of what I'm widening above kind of where I don't want the bass or the kick or things that are low end. I want them to kind of sit pretty squarely in the middle. But for everything else, for the high end and parts that are already panned, like the guitars, I'm just making them just a little bit wider sounding. But it's a pretty subtle difference. You probably, you know, wouldn't hear too much, but it's just meant there to sweeten it up a little bit. So the next thing I add in is a mix bus compressor. I'm using the SSL mix bus compressor plugin. I'm using the mastering preset. They even have, you know, a preset called mastering, which I've tweaked a little bit. I bring the attack time up, you know, so it's not cutting the transients too hard. You know, really shooting for about 2 dB of reduction, and therefore, you know, of compensation. I just kind of want to flatten it by just about 2 decibels, nothing more aggressive than that, because it's, you know, I've done a lot of other compressing along the way, so you don't want everything to be over compressed.
It's a compliment. You gotta be kidding. Grass grows over me.
And then the next is a bit crusher plugin, which I'm not using as a bit crusher. You know, I've turned the resolution all the way back up to 24-bit. I'm really using it to drive, to kind of clip the signal, to prepare it for limiting, right? To get rid of any of the super high transients. Also, about 3 dB of drive on the bit crusher. Let's turn it off first.
Facing the glass, it was just a laugh, it's whatever you say.
And then finally, Logic's adaptive limiter plugin, which is just a great limiter. Again, I put the ceiling where I want, you know, the point of no return to be, which is negative 0.1 dB. That's the highest, you know, amplitude I'm going to get. And I'm then just pushing gain, you know, to bring the signal level up underneath that, which is about 3 dB. You know, you want to I get basically, you know, not exact science, but I get to the point where the mix overall should really be, you know, topping at around anywhere from -6 to -3 dB, you know, in terms of max amplitude. And so that I have enough headroom that I can use these two plugins, the clipper and the limiter, and kind of push each of them by a little bit, you know. The math probably doesn't work out exactly right, but about 3 dB a piece, and then get up to a point where the mix feels really full and full scale without being completely brick walled. If you push the gain on this limiter much further, it'll be louder seeming, but it'll also kind of be brick walled, and, you know, it'll be too squashy and compressed and unnatural sounding. So I don't want it to sound unnatural, but I want it to be louder. So that's kind of what I'm going for. And I can keep an eye on the reduction, right? I don't want to see, basically put it differently, I don't want to see too much more than 2 to 3 dB of reduction in the final limiting stage, because then I know I've gone too, you know, the signal coming in is too hot, or the amount of you know, gain that I've added in the limiter is too much that it might sound unnatural. And so that about wraps up my breakdown of the mix for my cover of Dex Dark. Hopefully you guys found this helpful. I know there was, you know, sort of a lot of gory detail there in some areas, and maybe less so in others. So let me know in the comments, you know, what you'd like to see more of in the future. I really do enjoy kind of talking through this stuff and breaking it down. Maybe I'll do a little bit of the same thing with one of my original songs or another of my covers, and kind of walk through what I'm doing there. But hopefully this gives just a little glimpse into my process. I'm always looking to kind of improve, and, you know, while I have sort of patterns in terms of which plugins I go to and what kind of things I do, every song I kind of approach a little bit differently. And so definitely your mileage may vary, my own mileage may vary from song to song. I will be back with some more covers, instructional videos, and other content in the near future. So for now, stay well, and I'll talk to you guys soon.